Hi, everybody. I hope you had a nice long weekend. Today, we are going to be looking at the endocrine system as well as the lymphatic system. And we're going to start with the endocrine system. And again, a large focus will be on the pathologies or disordered states associated with these systems in the body. So, before we dive into the details, let's look at this overview diagram. So this is the endocrine system. Think of it as the body's longer distance communication network. So while your nervous system represents these neurons, or you can think of them as electrical wires, if you will, as an analogy, that are quick and direct. So those electrical signals are sent from neuron to neuron to the central nervous system from the periphery, and then integration happens, and after that there are motor responses or efferent responses that are sent out from the central nervous system, whether that's the brain or the spinal cord for reflexes, for example, to the peripheral tissues. So there is afferent information brought to the CNS, or sensory information, and then there is motor or efferent information sent out from the CNS out to the periphery. Now, the endocrine system is a communication network that is a little bit slower in its in that communication piece. So it releases what's called chemical messengers, and these chemical messengers are hormones. These hormones are released from a particular gland into the bloodstream. And this will communicate with a distant part of the body, telling it how to behave or what kind of effect it should have. So the endocrine system is largely made up of many glands, and glands are made up of specialized cells that form the tissues of the glands. And these cells produce and release hormones. Those hormones are released into the bloodstream, and they travel through the bloodstream to their target tissue or organ. At their target, they will bind to receptors in the cell membranes of that specific target tissue. And upon activating the receptors, these hormones will confer some kind of effect. And these receptors could be on the cell membrane, so on the surface, or they can be intracellular receptors within the cells, depending on what hormone we're talking about. But this demonstrates the mechanisms that the endocrine system performs in order to achieve effects on target tissues that help with balancing homeostasis. So the endocrine system is largely involved in regulating homeostasis in the body, ensuring that the body is performing within a specific range or around a favorable internal set point. Now, if we look at how this is performed, again, the glands are responsible for producing these hormones. And depending on the region of the body, we have various glands. So we have within the brain, we have the pineal gland, we have the hypothalamus, and we have the pituitary gland. And each of these glands either produces or releases specific hormones. And we'll look into the details of each gland as we move through this lecture. As we move down, we can see the thyroid gland in the neck region. The thymus is in the thoracic cavity, or in front of the thoracic cavity in the chest region. And as we move downward, the pancreas is in the abdominal region. The kidneys, we can see here kind of at the level of the lumbar spine, more posterior. Atop the kidneys is the adrenal glands. So the adrenal glands are right on top of the kidneys. They handle things like stress, whether that's short-term fight or fright, or even long-term stresses with the help of cortisol. So we can see specific glands produce specific hormones that carry out a certain effect or function. As we move more inferior, the gonads manage reproduction and reproductive development with the help of producing the sex hormones, estrogen and testosterone. So the important thing to remember with the endocrine system is that it serves to regulate homeostasis. This is the why behind every single one of these glands, to keep the body in a state of balance. So the purpose of the endocrine system, again, is to regulate organs in the body. And this is accomplished by glands releasing hormones. Scientifically speaking, a hormone is a chemical messenger released from a specific region of the body, a given gland, and it travels through the bloodstream and regulates the activity of cells in other parts of the body. And the way that they work, or the way that they function, is based on their chemical structure, which we can see on the right here. We can see the chemical molecular structure of various hormones. We see cortisol here, a stress hormone. We see progesterone, a sex hormone. We see melatonin, which regulates the sleep-wake cycle. So their chemical structure largely determines their function and the effect that they will confer on a target tissue. So this is how the system remains really precise in regulating the signals that it produces throughout the entire body. And the primary goal, again, of the system is homeostasis. So achieving this equilibrium or balance in the body's internal environment. The body is constantly being pushed or pulled away from its set point by external factors like temperature or internal factors like exercise. So the endocrine system maintains this balance through what's called feedback loops. For example, and we'll see this when we talk about the pancreas as a gland which releases insulin, but if blood glucose levels rise, the system senses this rise in blood glucose and coordinates a response to lower glucose levels back to a narrow range that is required for cellular survival. This coordination prevents systemic damage that can occur when these factors stray too far away from that set point. So negative outcomes can happen if blood glucose is maintained too high or too low outside of the favorable range. And this can include variables like pH, hydration levels, blood pressure. So all of these other examples, in addition to blood sugar levels, need to be maintained within that set point through homeostasis. Now, this also communicates regarding sending chemical signals to one or more glands. This refers to that endocrine axis. So again, one gland, such as the hypothalamus, may release a hormone, such as a releasing hormone, which is something that's pretty specific to the hypothalamus in the context that we're talking about today. The hypothalamus might secrete a releasing hormone that tells a second gland, the pituitary gland, to release another hormone, which gets released into the bloodstream and finally stimulates a third gland like the adrenal cortex to release cortisol. So we can see that there can be multi-step processes that allow for multiple points of regulation as well as amplification of the signal. And finally, we can look at timing. So some hormones, like adrenaline, for example, act within seconds, and they activate existing enzymes within a cell. So enzymes that have already been produced, are already present in a cell, can be activated by adrenaline, and this provides that really fast response, such as the fight or flight stress response. This is something that the body has adapted to perform quickly because it's important that we can alter physiological processes in the body quickly in response to things like sudden stress. That's something that we want to be able to react quickly to. Now, other hormones, such as, estrogens, so the estradiol, estrone, and estriol, these are different forms of estrogen. Or another one would be thyroxine, so thyroxine related to the thyroid gland. their effects may take hours, even days. And this is because these hormones will often travel to the cell nucleus. So once an estrogen, for example, is released from the gonads, so from the ovaries, it is going to travel through the bloodstream to a target tissue. And interestingly, estrogen works on many tissues in the body, such as muscle. Our skeletal muscles are responsive to estrogen levels. And once that estrogen reaches a muscle cell, it then will travel to the nucleus and trigger changes in gene expression. So it influences our DNA. And it will essentially tell the cell how to build new proteins. This triggers transcription and translation, right? That axis of protein synthesis. This takes time. And this is why how estrogen affects growth or muscle health or metabolic changes. These things aren't instantaneous. So they fall under the delayed effects category. Now, you don't need to know in detail the specific hormones that have delayed effects versus immediate. I would say it's important to recognize that adrenaline or those immediate stress hormones have very rapid effects because we can see that physiologically through increased heart rate, through, blood being diverted from the digestive organs to our muscle so that we can perform higher in a high stress environment or even during exercise. Whereas recognizing that there are other hormones, and we can use the example of estrogen, that may have more delayed effects because they will enter into the cell and trigger gene expression, influencing our DNA to make new proteins. So that takes a little bit longer. So recognizing that there are kind of two axes here of the endocrine system that may be faster and may work a little bit slower. So now we're going to go through the components of the endocrine system and each gland individually to discuss not only its structure and function, but some pathologies that are associated with it. So what happens if that gland is not functioning properly? And we're going to start with what's referred to as the master glands, if you will, the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. So to understand these structures, we will look deep into the base and central region of the brain. The hypothalamus here is this very small but vital region located below the thalamus, which is this egg-shaped region of the brain. And it's directly above the brainstem here. It serves as the main link between the nervous system and the endocrine system. And if we zoom in, now this region here is the kind of triangle, if you will, that's highlighted in blue in this photo. If we zoom into that, we can see the hypothalamus, is that in blue? And then below, we can see this little stalk here on this image, and we've increased its size here. This represents the pituitary gland. So hypothalamus up here, and a stalk coming off of it is the pituitary gland. So hanging just below the hypothalamus by this thin stalk, this stalk is called the infundibulum, one of my favorite words in the scientific world. But the infundibulum is this stalk hanging from the hypothalamus, and from that is the pituitary gland. And the pituitary gland is made up of two distinct units, the posterior pituitary, so this would be towards the back of the brain, and the anterior pituitary, towards the front of the brain. Now, a common misconception is that the posterior pituitary is a gland that produces hormones. But scientifically, the posterior pituitary does not make its own hormones. How it works is that it's an extension of the hypothalamus's neural tissue. And so specialized neurons in the hypothalamus synthesize the hormones antidiuretic hormone, ADH, and oxytocin. And these hormones then travel down the long axons of these neurons into the posterior pituitary. And they're stored here in the posterior pituitary. So the posterior pituitary does not make its own hormones. The hypothalamus produces them and sends them to the posterior pituitary. When the brain senses a need for these hormones, such as dehydration, in response to being dehydrated, your body produces anti-diuretic hormone. A diuretic, think diarrhea, it causes the release of water from your system, right? So anti-diuretic hormone, when released from the posterior pituitary, is going to prevent water loss. So it's going to lead to more concentration of the urine, right? You won't go to the bathroom as often. It is going to stimulate the absorption of water into the bloodstream. So maintaining water in the bloodstream when you're dehydrated to maintain blood volume. It may also trigger, through the release of oxytocin, uterine contractions or breast milk ejection during pregnancy or post-pregnancy. So to either stimulate childbirth or the production of breast milk. So these are very rapid responses, right? It allows a rapid response to physiological triggers such as dehydration or childbirth. Now, the anterior pituitary refers to this master gland mechanism a little bit more. The anterior pituitary is true glandular tissue that makes its own hormones, but it only releases them when the hypothalamus tells it to. The hypothalamus releases what's called releasing hormones through a specialized blood vessel system that goes from the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary. Once the hypothalamus sends releasing hormones to the anterior pituitary then releases a specific hormone that is required at that time. So these releasing hormones are specific, telling the anterior pituitary which of its many hormones that it makes to produce. So the anterior pituitary does make its own hormones, but the hypothalamus tells it when to release them. And this includes growth hormone, which stimulates cell reproduction, so cell division, and the regeneration of tissues. An example, it triggers the liver to release growth factors that increase protein synthesis in muscles, for example. Stimulates growth in the body. It might also influence our bones' growth hormone to promote bone growth. So growth hormone levels are very much elevated during development. As a child is growing through a growth spurt, if you will, growth hormone stimulates that. Prolactin primarily stimulates milk production from the mammary glands to allow for breastfeeding. Adrenocorticotropin hormone, we'll see this again, this targets the adrenal glands. And it triggers the release of cortisol during stress. So if you recall from the slide before, this represents one of those mechanisms with many steps. So the hypothalamus releases its releasing hormones, telling the anterior pituitary to release adrenocorticotropic hormone if it's needed. Adrenocorticotropic hormone enters the bloodstream, and it is going to go on to stimulate the adrenal glands that sit atop the kidneys. And it will tell the adrenal glands to release cortisol. Cortisol is a stress hormone. So cortisol will be released during stress to stimulate the stress response. Thyroid stimulating hormone targets the thyroid, another multi-step process where the pituitary stimulates or releases hormones, specifically thyroid stimulating hormone, that stimulates the thyroid gland to produce the metabolic hormones T3 and T4. So the thyroid is responding to the anterior pituitary, which tells it when to release its own hormones. And finally, follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone are what's called gonadotropins. They regulate the functions of the ovaries and the testes. So they govern reproductive cycles and sex hormone production as well. So now let's look at some pathological states when there are health conditions relating to these structures or when things go wrong. So now that we understand how the pituitary gland releases hormones, we'll look at what happens when that signal becomes, on one end, too strong. And one example of that is the condition called acromegaly. So acromegaly is a condition related to hypersecretion. So hyper meaning too much. In the vast majority of cases, acromegaly is caused by a benign tumor on the pituitary gland, specifically on the anterior pituitary, called an adenoma. We talked about how the anterior pituitary releases growth hormone. So if there is a tumor on the anterior pituitary, the tumor ignores the stop signals from the hypothalamus and causes the anterior pituitary to continuously pump out growth hormone. So normally the hypothalamus regulates or governs when the pituitary, specifically the anterior pituitary, releases growth hormone. If there is a tumor on the anterior pituitary, then this causes the pituitary to continuously release growth hormone into the bloodstream in this case. This is long after the body has finished its natural growth phase. And so these patients who experience this might end up developing increased growth of bones in the face, hands, and feet, for example. So we can see here, this is showing the hand of a person with this pathology on the right. So the bones on the hand and the structures of the hand are significantly larger than someone who does not have this condition on the left. So in children before puberty, the growth plates at the end of the long bones are still open, and this is what allows for growth. If growth hormone is too high, then the person develops what's called gigantism. So this is a disorder in children that is caused by the secretion of abnormally high levels of growth hormone. And this individual or these individuals will grow very tall because there is a heightened release of growth hormone while the plates at the end of their long bones are still open. So they're still susceptible to those growth signals. And this causes increased growth in children. Once we reach adulthood, those plates, the growth plates, fuse into solid bone, and they can no longer grow in length. However, in adults, the bones can still grow in thickness and density. So this is where we see acromegaly. If the tumor develops in adulthood, the adult may not grow necessarily taller, but they will have increased growth of the bones in the face, hands, and feet in width. We can see that width difference here, and even just the general thickness of the bone. So in height, it would probably be a lot greater as well. Now, we can notice here when we're looking at it, again, this isn't just swelling, it's actually the physical remodeling of the bone and connective tissue. In addition to what we see here on the outside, growth hormone affects metabolism. So it can lead to enlarged internal organs as well, such as the heart, and secondary issues like type 2 diabetes, because growth hormone actually opposes the action of insulin. So it can have many influences, not just on external structures, but also on metabolic processes as well. It can influence the cardiovascular system, as I mentioned, and the heart can undergo hypertrophy, meaning the heart muscle is enlarging to be able to actually work harder to pump blood through this much larger circulatory network. Now we're going to shift our focus to the adrenal gland. So we're moving inferior, right? I mentioned that first we were talking about the hypothalamus pituitary. Now I'm going to come to the adrenal glands just for the purposes of the flow here. But we'll also be talking about the thyroid and pancreas as we move on. So the adrenal glands influence our body's stress response. They are these triangular shaped glands that are located on top of each kidney. So on the posterior end of the body, behind the abdomen or the abdominal region, you have the kidneys. And even though they are relatively small, They're extremely important for various survival mechanisms. And one key feature of the adrenal glands is that they actually receive one of the highest rates of blood flow in the entire body. And this allows their hormones to be released into the bloodstream and distributed throughout the body very quickly. They produce hormones that regulate several critical functions, such as metabolism, immune function, blood pressure, and the body's response to stress. So let's look at those in a little bit more detail. In terms of stress and just metabolism in general, the adrenal medulla, or the inner region of the adrenal glands, release hormones involved in the fight or flight response. So this includes epinephrine, or also known as adrenaline, norepinephrine, which is noradrenaline. And these hormones act within seconds. So upon release, when you are in a stressful situation or in a heightened stress state, epinephrine and noradrenaline can be released within seconds to increase heart rate. They increase blood pressure, and they also increase blood glucose. Why might you think that it's important for blood glucose to be increased during the stress response? Well, if you are in a high stress situation, your body might need to run away from the threat, right? To physically run away, to also mentally be able to make decisions quicker. And so mobilizing glucose into the blood provides increased opportunity for your cells to metabolize energy. So that glucose is mobilized into the bloodstream. It can then go to the brain. It can go to the cells of our muscles to be able to be used for energy and allow for those things like running away from a threat or increased capacity to make decisions and more alertness if blood is brought to the brain. So that's why that's part of the stress response. The outer region of the adrenal glands release corticosteroid hormones, such as cortisol. Cortisol affects metabolism, blood sugar, and the stress response as well. So it's a more longer acting stress response hormone, cortisol. It also affects aldosterone. Aldosterone regulates blood pressure and sodium water balance. And so these hormones are part of the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. So the adrenal glands do not work on their own. They are part of this connection from hypothalamus to pituitary to adrenal glands. And this is how it works. The hypothalamus is the first to respond to stress. This can be physical stress like illness or injury, or psychological stress like fear or anxiety. In response, the hypothalamus sends releasing hormones or signals to the pituitary gland. In response, the pituitary gland, which is often referred to as that master gland, receives this signal and releases adrenocorticotropic hormone. I know it was written on the last side, but I should have put this here, sorry. Adrenocorticotropic hormone. So adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH, is released from the pituitary, and it travels through the bloodstream to the adrenal glands. And it's here at the adrenal glands, specifically the adrenal cortex, where it stimulates the release of cortisol, that primary stress hormone. So there's a very close association of the hypothalamus and the pituitary and the adrenal glands. Cortisol helps the body cope with stress by increasing blood sugar levels so we have energy, raising blood pressure, suppressing those non-essential functions like digestion and some immune responses during stressful situations. And this is why individuals who are going through long-term chronic stress will often develop digestive issues, or they develop a suppressed immune system or weakened immune responses, I should say. So their immune system becomes dampened during stressful situations, and especially if the stress is chronic. The system is tightly regulated through negative feedback. So once the cortisol levels in the blood are high enough, they eventually will signal the hypothalamus and pituitary to reduce hormone release, preventing excessive cortisol production. But in long-term high-stress situations, this system becomes overdriven, and you have significant releases and cortisol influences in the body. Now, when the adrenal cortex fails to produce enough hormones, we get Addison's disease. And Addison's disease is typically an autoimmune condition where the body actually attacks its own adrenal tissue. And because the body is attacking the tissue of the adrenal glands, the immune system is attacking it, you end up getting the hyposecretion of the hormones that the adrenal gland produces, corticosteroids. So you get undersecretion of cortisol and aldosterone because the immune system is attacking the adrenal gland. So this will result in dampened effects that cortisol typically has. So it results in low blood glucose or hypoglycemia. And because aldosterone, which is normally released from the adrenal glands, typically has the role of traveling through the bloodstream to the kidneys and telling the kidneys to retain sodium. This leads to low sodium levels in the blood or hyponatremia as well. Now, an Addisonian crisis is the extreme case here. So long-term lack of these hormones that don't manage fluid balance, or you have a lack of hormones regulating glucose levels. If this is a chronic state, then blood pressure can drop to very lethal levels, having extreme hypotension, and this can lead to cardiovascular collapse. So extremely low blood pressure. On the other end of the spectrum, so that's Addison's. That's when we have low secretion of corticosteroids, which causes a lack of cortisol and aldosterone release, therefore low blood glucose and low blood sodium levels. This can be very catastrophic. All ultimately caused by typically an autoimmune condition where the immune system is attacking the adrenal glands. There can be other causes as well, but that's one of the most common causes. On the other end of the spectrum here, we have Cushing syndrome, which is hypersecretion of cortisol. So in this case, now the adrenal gland is producing too much cortisol. This can be caused by a tumor in the pituitary gland, causing it to send too much adrenocorticotropic hormone, just like a tumor in the pituitary could cause too much growth hormone release, right? In this case, if this tumor causes too much adrenocorticotropic hormone, that means you have way more hormones stimulating the adrenal glands to make cortisol. Another cause of this could be long-term use of steroid medications, such as prednisone. This leads to the overproduction of cortisol as well. Excess cortisol forces the body into a constant stress metabolism. So, what are those effects that we try to confer when we're under constant stress? Again, high blood sugar, right? Because we mobilize sugar in a stress state. So people with excessive production of cortisol end up developing hyperglycemia or prolonged high blood sugar because the body's constantly mobilizing glucose. This ends up causing symptoms such as moon face or moon-shaped face and weight gain because cortisol promotes adipose tissue redistribution. So fat is moved from the limbs and it's deposited in the face region, the abdomen, and the upper back, causing a hump at the upper back. So if we look at this diagram, we can also see influences on the skin and muscles, cortisol is catabolic, right? It mobilizes glucose, it breaks down tissues to find energy. In high amounts, it eventually begins breaking down proteins, for example, in the muscles to create more blood sugar. So this can lead to muscle wasting, eventually bone pain. So it becomes as you can see with both of these conditions, especially with endocrine diseases, there's this chain effect where one negative outcome triggers another issue in the body, and then that triggers another one, and so forth. And we can see the two opposite ends of the spectrum here with adrenal gland disorders. Now we are going to move back up to the thyroid and parathyroid gland. So let's move to the neck. And the thyroid gland is a butterfly-shaped organ that is located anterior to or in front of the trachea. Now, metabolically, it is very vascularized in this region. So it has a rich blood supply to quickly distribute hormones to the rest of the body. And it produces two primary metabolic hormones, T3 and T4. These hormones enter almost every cell in your body and increase the activity of the mitochondria. This therefore regulates your basal metabolic rate. So it dictates how fast you burn fuel for energy, which in turn will influence heart rate, how quickly you digest food, and even how your brain develops in early life. It also manages bone maintenance by ensuring a steady turnover or renewing of bone tissue. And there's another hormone that the thyroid releases called calcitonin. Calcitonin is going to regulate blood calcium levels. And it does this by inhibiting what's called bone resorption. This means that it essentially shuts down the cells that break down bone, called osteoclasts. Bone is constantly being remodeled. You're constantly building your bone with the calcium from the bloodstream and from your diet, and you're constantly breaking down bone by these cells called osteoclasts that constantly remodel our bones, and this contributes to bone health. But what calcitonin does is it inhibits those bones or those cells that break down the bone. So it inhibits bone resorption, it inhibits the osteoclasts. This happens when blood calcium is too high. The osteoclasts break down bone to mobilize calcium into the bloodstream. Calcitonin is going to inhibit bone resorption, and therefore that calcium remains in the bones, and this lowers the levels that are found in your bloodstream. On the other side of the spectrum, and contributing to the feedback loop here, the parathyroid glands are found on the back of the thyroid, and they release parathyroid hormone. Parathyroid hormone has the opposite effect of calcitonin. It is going to promote bone resorption. So it promotes the breakdown of bone by stimulating those cells, the osteoclasts. So parathyroid hormone promotes the breakdown of bone when blood calcium levels are too low. And this condition is called hypocalcemia. Hypocalcemia is low blood calcium. When blood calcium levels are low, parathyroid hormone is going to promote bone resorption. And the body will quickly gain that source of calcium that your heart requires and your muscles require to work. So we can see this balance here. When blood calcium levels are low, parathyroid hormone is released to promote the resorption of bone or the breakdown of bone. When blood calcium levels are too high, calcitonin is released, and it's going to then inhibit bone resorption. So it is essentially going to promote the maintenance of calcium in your bones. So we see this cycle here. High blood calcium, calcitonin is released. Low blood calcium, parathyroid hormone is released. And we try to find this maintenance of stable calcium levels through the action of these two hormones. Now, let's look at what happens when there are issues with the thyroid gland itself. And the first term that we're going to look at is goiter. Goiter, as a medical term, is simply referring to an abnormal enlargement of the thyroid gland. You can see its butterfly shape and how it's uniformly enlarged in this photo. This happens when the gland itself is overstimulated by thyroid stimulating hormone, so TSH. If there is abnormal production of TSH by the pituitary gland, it is going to release too much thyroid stimulating hormone. And that stimulates the thyroid. If the thyroid is hyperstimulated, it increases in size to try to produce more and more of its own hormones that it produces, T3 and T4 and calcitonin. So a goiter can happen with hyperthyroidism, too much production of thyroid hormone, because it's overstimulated from the pituitary gland. But you can also have an enlarged thyroid in some cases because of hypothyroidism. So hypothyroidism, in some cases, is caused by a lack of dietary iodine, and the thyroid needs iodine to build T3 and T4. So as a response of low iodine levels in the diet, hypothyroidism may occur, or too little, and this can also cause the thyroid to enlarge. So in response to an enlarged thyroid, an individual must assess their blood iodine levels to determine whether hypothyroidism or hyperthyroidism is occurring. So hyperthyroidism itself is elevated thyroid hormones in the blood. And if we think about the role of thyroid hormones, we know that T3 and T4 influence metabolic rate. So we'll see rapid weight loss, even if the person is eating more. We'll see increased heartbeat or tachycardia. The nervous system becomes overstimulated, so sweating, tremors may occur. So these things are demonstrating if elevated thyroid hormones are present in the blood, you see increased normal effects of the thyroid. Now, the most common form of hyperthyroidism is Graves' disease. I'm going to get to exophthalmic goiter in a second, but Graves' disease is an autoimmune condition where the body produces antibodies that mimic the signal of thyroid stimulating hormone. So these imposter antibodies, if you will, trick the thyroid gland into thinking that it's told to produce more hormones constantly. And the signature symptom of Graves' disease or hyperthyroidism is this exophthalmic goiter. And what this is, we can see it present in this photo, and it causes bulging eyes. So this happens because this autoimmune reaction causes inflammation and buildup of tissues and fat behind the eyeballs. This pushes the eyeballs outward. And it can have negative consequences on the eyes too, like light sensitivity and double vision. So we can see that hyperthyroidism increases thyroid hormone production, therefore increasing the typical effects of thyroid hormones in the body, heightening those effects. And it can influence other structures in the body as well, such as the eyes, and influences our metabolic rate. This can be driven by various things, as we saw, like a tumor on the pituitary gland, causing for an increased release of TSH, therefore increasing the release of thyroid hormones. or it can be caused by autoimmune conditions where the body produces antibodies that mimic the signal of TSH. So it could be caused by too much TSH from a tumor in the pituitary, or our immune system mimicking the effects of TSH to overstimulate the thyroid gland. Now I'm going to pause the video here. Please stay tuned for part 2 of the endocrine system.